deep in the shadowed folds of the Kentucky Appalachians, where fog clings to the ridges like a shroud and the ground itself seems to whisper secrets, there exists a chapter of history so vile that even local records bend around it, refusing to speak its name. Between 1878 and 1892, more than 50 travelers vanished without a trace along the narrow routes that cut through Harlan County, a place where coal dust stained the air and strangers rarely left with their stories intact. The official explanations were predictable: wild animals, accidents, drunken wanderings. But the silence that followed each disappearance carried the weight of something darker. You see, during those exact years, one family, hidden in the limestone hollows outside Pine Mountain, became the largest meat suppliers in the region, though their livestock herds were laughably small. They called themselves the McGraws, an Appalachian clan of butchers whose smokehouses never seemed to rest, whose knives were always sharp, and whose bellies grew fat while their neighbors scraped by. For over a century, county officials denied the rumors, insisting nothing sinister had ever happened. But the truth was never gone. It lay buried in forgotten journals, in testimonies locked away, in letters that scholars refused to publish. What those scraps reveal is horrifying beyond comprehension. Not just murder, but the systematic harvest of human flesh sold under the guise of Appalachian trade. The McGraws did not merely kill. They fed upon the people who passed through their valley. Before we descend further into this blood-soaked story, I need you to do something. If you are drawn to forbidden truths that history tried to bury, subscribe now, because what I am about to reveal has been deliberately kept from you. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from, your city, your state, your country. I want to see how far this dark trail reaches. How many of you stand outside the veil that once concealed the McGraws? And to those ready to step deeper, type the phrase, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments. Seal this truth within you, for once you hear what happened in those Kentucky mountains, you can never return to ignorance. The Devil's Creek Valley was never meant to hold human settlement. And yet, in its silence, the McGraws built an empire of flesh. The valley where the McGraws rooted themselves was a natural trap, half a mile wide at its broadest point, flanked by jagged limestone cliffs that rose like prison walls. It forced all traffic through a single, narrow passage. For centuries, the Cherokee had used the path to move between the Kentucky River Basin and the coal-rich mountains further east. By the late 1800s, with coal fever spreading like wildfire, the trail became a lifeline for merchants, engineers, and prospectors. This meant strangers, men with pockets full of cash, documents, and contracts, were forced through a bottleneck that funneled them straight into the McGraw family's reach. And what appeared to outsiders as a modest log homestead, with a few thin cattle grazing along the ridges, concealed a far darker infrastructure. Behind the McGraw house stood 2 smokehouses, a curing shed, and a root cellar dug deep into the mountain. Locals marveled that their sausages and jerk meats carried a flavor no one else could replicate. Merchants from as far away as Lexington and even Knoxville sent for their product, mountain beef, they called it, though those who ate too much often remarked on a strange aftertaste that clung to the back of the throat. At the head of this operation were 3 brothers, Elias, Jonah, and Levi McGraw. Elias, the eldest, tall and gaunt with pale eyes that seemed to look through men rather than at them, handled business dealings with a politeness so polished it disarmed suspicion. Jonah, the middle brother, was the craftsman, a butcher whose skill with a blade bordered on surgical artistry. And Levi, the youngest, was quiet, reserved, but known for his brute strength. He could quarter a steer, or a man, faster than anyone in the region. Neighbors often whispered about how the McGraws thrived without expanding their herds. But when pressed, Elias had answers ready: cattle brought in from Tennessee, bartered livestock moved through private deals, or most often, vague stories of connections in the valleys beyond. None of it could be proven false, but none of it ever felt right. Still, prosperity dulls suspicion. While other mountain families survived by scraping together subsistence crops, the McGraws flourished. Their smokehouses belched a constant haze, their larders remained full, and their coin purses grew heavy. Travelers lined up to buy what they thought was sustenance for the road ahead. But many of those travelers never made it past Devil's Creek. And in time, the first cracks of truth began to show. The first signs that something was deeply wrong came in the summer of 1879, when a peddler named Jonathan Wade failed to arrive at the settlement where he was expected. Wade was a familiar face on the Appalachian roads, hauling his wagon of tin goods and cheap fabrics between mining camps. He was known for his punctuality and his sharp tongue, a man who could haggle for hours but never failed to deliver on his promises. When he vanished, neighbors assumed bandits had struck, or perhaps that he had slipped on the cliffs and fallen into the creek's hidden caverns. But weeks later, the mystery deepened. Wade's horse was found grazing peacefully in a hollow less than a mile from the McGraw homestead. Its harness was intact, its cargo nearly untouched. More unsettling still, his satchel of coins remained in the saddlebag, untouched, gleaming as if someone had deliberately left it behind. What thief leaves the money? The men of the valley organized a search. They scoured caves, climbed cliffs, and waded the creek's icy veins. For 3 days they hunted, but no body, no blood, no trace of struggle emerged. And while neighbors fretted, the McGraw smokehouses poured out thicker plumes than usual, filling the valley with the stench of burning hickory. Elias McGraw was present in every search, calm and composed, suggesting Wade had likely fallen victim to drifters or drunken misfortune. His words soothed many, but to a few they rang hollow. Months passed, and the pattern repeated. A surveyor disappeared, then a coal agent from Virginia, then a young couple traveling westward. Each time their horses were found, their belongings intact, but their bodies gone, as though swallowed whole by the mountains. The official explanations strained thinner with every case, and still the McGraw enterprise thrived. Their meats were in greater demand than ever, their coin flowing. Yet their cattle herds never grew. Not a single neighbor could recall hearing the bray of newly driven steers, nor the sound of livestock being corralled through the valley's narrow trail. The math no longer added up. Those who lived closest to the McGraws, farmers, storekeepers, widows scraping survival from the mountain soil, began to wonder quietly at first, then in whispers behind closed doors. What exactly was being smoked in those sheds? Because by then, some had already tasted the truth. The valley folk had long believed in signs: owls hooting at noon, dogs howling at empty woods, fireflies burning in strange clusters. But no omen was darker than what unfolded after the second disappearance. The McGraws, with their uncanny timing, held what they called a gathering that autumn. They claimed it was to honor the harvest, though no fields of corn or wheat surrounded their land. The event began innocently enough. Families from nearby ridges were invited to share in roasted meats and sweet cider. Children laughed, fiddles played, and for a moment the valley seemed safe again. Elias McGraw moved among the crowd with his polite smile, raising toasts, assuring neighbors that no shadow lay upon their land. Jonah tended the spit, carving slabs of smoked flesh that dripped with juices, while Levi carried barrels of cider as though they weighed nothing. But beneath the merriment lurked something older, something ritualistic. As the sun sank and the moon rose pale above the limestone cliffs, the tone shifted. Elias, tall and spectral in the firelight, called for silence. He spoke of the old ways of the mountain, of giving thanks not merely to God, but to the land itself, the rock, the trees, and the hidden veins of water that sustained them. His words were poetic, but threaded with menace. Then came the offering. Jonah carried forward a wrapped bundle, laid it upon the table, and unwrapped what appeared to be a skinned carcass, small and glistening. The neighbors assumed it was a piglet, but those closest swore later that the shape was all wrong. The limbs too long, the bones too fine. Children were ushered away before questions could be asked. The music resumed, but it was thinner, more nervous now, and though people ate, few spoke of the flavor. From that night on, the McGraw's reputation changed. To outsiders, they were still the prosperous family with the best smoked meats in Kentucky. But among the valley folk, whispers spread like wildfire. Some refused to attend further gatherings. Others claimed they had seen strangers enter the McGraw homestead, but never emerge. Dogs barked at the edges of the property, refusing to cross the fence line. And yet, no lawman came, no sheriff rode in. Out here, justice was left to the mountain itself. But the mountain, it seemed, had chosen to keep the McGraws safe. By the winter of 1880, The disappearances could no longer be dismissed as chance. 5 travelers were gone, all last seen within a mile of Devil's Creek. Their wagons abandoned, their livestock unharmed, their coin untouched. It was a pattern too clean, too deliberate. But still, without bodies the law could not move. And without the law the burden of truth fell on whispers. One whisper grew louder than the rest: the meats. Merchants in Lexington noted that the McGraw sausages carried a richness unlike anything else on the market. Miners in Harlan joked grimly that one bite could fill a man's belly for 2 days. And yet, those who consumed it often described strange dreams, nightmares of pale hands reaching out from beneath floorboards, of teeth gnashing in the dark. A schoolteacher who sampled their jerky swore she awoke the next morning with the taste of iron in her mouth, as though she'd bitten her own tongue raw. Neighbors, once eager for the McGraw's generosity, began declining invitations. Some claimed their hounds whined and clawed at the door whenever the smokehouses burned heavy. Others noticed bones, too small, too delicate, among the ash pits when the wind scattered them across the valley floor. And still the McGraws smiled. Elias, ever the diplomat, doubled his travels, courting new markets. Jonah perfected new cuts, new cures. Levi hauled barrels of salted flesh into wagons bound for distant towns. The more suspicion grew at home, the farther their trade reached abroad. By 1881, their meats fed not just miners and merchants, but even the dining tables of wealthy families in Louisville. It was during this boom that the second ritual emerged. Unlike the harvest gathering, this was private, held deep within the limestone caves that honeycombed the valley walls. No fiddles, no cider, no neighbors, just the 3 brothers and their guest. What exactly took place is known only through fragments, scraps of testimony gathered decades later. But all accounts agree blood was spilled deliberately, poured onto the rock floor, and the body was never recovered. The caves became their temple, the smokehouse their altar, and the valley their hunting ground. For those who lived nearby, the fear was suffocating. Children were warned not to wander. Travelers were urged to take longer, safer routes. And yet, despite every precaution, the disappearances continued. And in the heart of it all, the smoke never stopped rising. By the spring of 1882, the valley lived under a shadow. No one said the McGraw's name aloud after dark. No one lingered near Devil's Creek after sunset. Mothers warned their children that to wander too close was to be swallowed whole, not by wolves or bears, but by something human wearing the mask of kin. The valley men, farmers hardened by thin soil, miners blackened by coal dust, began meeting in secret. They gathered in barns lit only by lanterns, speaking in hushed tones about the pattern they could no longer ignore. 5 gone, then 7, then 9. The sheriff, posted 30 miles away, dismissed the rumors as mountain superstition. But the locals knew better. They had seen the smoke, they had tasted the meat. One farmer, Ezra Collins, confessed what many had already suspected. He had sold a calf to the McGraws months earlier, a strong beast with a scar on its flank. Weeks later, when Jonah offered him smoked ribs at a gathering, Ezra swore the bones carried no sign of a scar. And worse, the marrow was too fine, too fragile for cattle. He had kept one bone in secret, hiding it in his barn. When shown to a traveling doctor, the man blanched. "This is not from a beast," he whispered. The revelation spread like wildfire. Suddenly, the valley was alive with fear and fury. The women pressed their husbands to act. The men sharpened blades and counted rifles. But Elias McGraw, as though sensing the shift, grew bolder. He strode into the settlement tavern one evening, pale eyes gleaming, and bought drinks for the room. He spoke of prosperity, of opportunity, of the wealth the valley could claim if it joined in his enterprise. His words dripped with confidence, but underneath, some swore they heard the edge of a threat. Meanwhile, strange sounds began echoing from the limestone caves at night, chanting, guttural and rhythmic, mingled with the low moans of something in pain. A trapper claimed he saw torchlight flicker deep inside and heard the crack of bones against stone. The community's patience snapped. Plans were laid. If the law would not come, the mountain would deliver its own verdict. A group of 12 men, bound by blood oath, vowed to uncover what lay within the smokehouses. But what they found there would haunt them until their graves. It was a moonless night when the 12 men crossed Devil's Creek. Their boots sank into the mud, their breath clouding in the cold air. They carried shotguns, axes, and lanterns hooded to slivers of light. Each man had sworn the same oath to uncover the truth, no matter what waited in the dark. They approached from the ridge, not the road, slipping between trees until the McGraw homestead came into view. The smokehouses stood like squat sentinels, their chimneys belching the familiar haze that tainted the valley. No dogs barked. No light shone from the house. It was too quiet, as though the family had been expecting them. Ezra Collins was the first to move. He pressed his ear to the nearest smokehouse door. From within came the steady hiss of fire, and something else. A wet, rhythmic sound. Not the crackle of fat from beef or pork, but the unmistakable tearing of sinew. His stomach churned. He nodded to the others. With a heave, they broke the door. The lantern light spilled over hooks, chains, and slabs of flesh hanging in rows. At first, the men told themselves it was cattle, but as they stepped closer, the truth could not be denied. The shapes were wrong, arms bent at strange angles, fingers curled, torsos too narrow for livestock. One body still wore a fragment of cloth, a torn shirt sleeve that had once been white. The smell was unbearable, not the scent of smoked meat, but of rot barely masked by hickory. Men gagged, stumbled back. One dropped his lantern, nearly setting the floor ablaze. And yet, in the midst of their horror, they heard it, a faint cry, muffled. From beneath the planks, they tore at the floor with axes, ripping up boards until they uncovered a hatch. Beneath lay a pit, shallow, damp, reeking of blood, and in it a man still breathing, his face pale and gaunt, his body half flayed. He tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped. That was when the McGraws struck. Elias appeared in the doorway, calm as ever, a rifle leveled at the intruders. Jonah stood behind him, cleaver glinting in the lantern light. Levi's bulk filled the frame, silent as a shadow. The 12 men realized, too late, that they had not come as hunters. They had walked straight into the lair. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The 12 men stood frozen, lanterns flickering over the horror that dangled from the hooks and rotted in the pit. Across from them, the McGraw brothers blocked the only exit, their silhouettes carved against the smoke and fire. Elias spoke first. His voice was steady, almost soothing, as though this were a business meeting and not a slaughterhouse. "You've seen what was never yours to see," he said. "This land has its appetite. We only feed it, as do you when you take deer or hog. The difference, gentlemen, is that we waste nothing." Jonah stepped forward, the cleaver in his hand catching the glow. His apron was already stained dark, his eyes wide with something feverish. "You came hungry for truth," he hissed. "Then eat it. Look upon it. Taste it if you dare." Levi said nothing. He simply cracked his knuckles, a sound that echoed like breaking twigs. The vigilantes raised their weapons, shotguns leveled, axes poised, but hesitation gnawed at them. To fire meant a bloodbath. To retreat meant surrender. And all the while, from the pit beneath the floorboards, the broken man rasped and wheezed. Proof undeniable that evil stood before them. Ezra Collins, clutching his lantern, finally broke the stalemate. He spat at the dirt. "No more," he growled. "This ends tonight," and he pulled the trigger. The room erupted. The shotgun blast tore into Levi's shoulder, spinning him back. Jonah lunged, cleaver flashing, striking one vigilante across the jaw. Elias fired his rifle, dropping another man before the smoke could even clear. The confined space turned chaos. The crack of gunfire, the wet chop of steel, the screams of men fighting not just for justice but for their lives. Lanterns toppled. Flames licked at the walls. Smoke poured into the rafters, mixing with the choking stench of charred flesh. In the confusion, the pit yawned wider, and the dying man's cries were swallowed by the roar. When the survivors finally stumbled into the night, half their number lay inside, torn apart, shot, or simply vanished into the smoke. Of the McGraws, no bodies were found. The homestead itself burned, collapsing into embers before dawn. But in the ashes, among the bones and iron hooks, one truth remained: the McGraws had not perished. They had slipped into the caves, into the belly of the mountain itself, and the mountain was not finished with them. The morning after the fire, the valley gathered in silence at the blackened ruin. Smoke still curled from the timbers, carrying with it the bitter stench of blood and burned flesh. The vigilantes who had survived stood apart from the others, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling. They had come seeking proof, and they had found it. too much of it. Yet no words could capture the horror of what had hung inside those smokehouses. When they tried to explain, their voices faltered. Some wept openly. Others could only stammer about bones, hooks, and screams. But the worst detail of all was this: though half the vigilantes had been slain, none of the McGraw's bodies were found. The brothers had disappeared into the limestone caves that webbed the valley, leaving only blood trails that led to fissures too narrow for men to follow. From that day forward, Devil's Creek became forbidden ground. Farmers abandoned their fields near the ridge. Travelers took the long way around, even if it cost them days. Children were warned never to approach the cliffs, for the caves, it was said, could whisper. At night, strange sounds echoed from the hollows, low chants, muffled cries, and the steady ring of steel against stone. And the disappearances did not stop. In fact, they grew worse. A year after the fire, a family traveling westward vanished without a trace. Their wagon was found overturned near the creek, the horse grazing calmly nearby, reins still intact. No blood, no struggle, just absence. 2 months later, a prospector failed to return from the ridge, then a preacher, then 3 young boys hunting rabbits. Always the same story: belongings left behind, animals unharmed, but the people gone as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Whispers turned into legend. Some swore the McGraws had struck a bargain with the mountain, feeding it in exchange for protection. Others claimed they had become something less than men. Shadows that moved through stone, appearing only when the valley needed to be reminded of fear. And every so often, when the wind shifted just right, the scent would return. Not the smell of wood smoke, but of hickory mixed with something darker, rich, metallic, unmistakable. The valley folk would shutter their windows, cross themselves, and pray, because everyone knew the McGraws were still out there, and they were still hungry. By the mid-1880s, the story of Devil's Creek had drifted beyond the valley. Merchants carried whispers along the trade routes, miners told tales at campfires, and preachers used the name McGraw as a warning to children who strayed too far from home. To some, it was dismissed as mountain superstition, nothing more than folk tales spun by isolated communities. But to others, hunters, bounty men, fortune seekers, it was an invitation. The first outsiders to arrive were bounty hunters from Virginia. They had heard there was coin to be made in capturing the McGraws, dead or alive. Armed with pistols and a thirst for glory, they descended into the limestone caves with torches. For 3 days, the valley saw the glow of firelight flickering across the cliffs. On the 4th day, the hunters did not return. Their horses wandered back to town without riders, saddlebags torn open as though clawed by something far stronger than any beast. Next came journalists. A correspondent from Louisville arrived, notebook in hand, determined to expose the myth of the cannibal butchers. He stayed 1 week in the valley interviewing families, sketching the ruins of the McGraw homestead. Then he vanished during a morning walk. His notebook was later discovered on the creek bank. Inside were frantic scrawls. They watch from the caves. The smoke is not gone. Even the law tried once more. A sheriff from Frankfort rode in with deputies, declaring he would put an end to the rumors. They searched the caves with dynamite, blasting open entrances, collapsing tunnels. For a time, it seemed they might succeed. The strange cries ceased, and the disappearances slowed, but only for a season. By the next winter, a trapper vanished, then a schoolgirl on her way home. The mountain had simply shifted, opening new mouths to swallow the living. The legend began to evolve. The McGraws were no longer spoken of as men. Some said they had become spirits bound to the caves, their hunger eternal. Others claimed they were flesh still, sustained by unholy rituals, living longer than nature allowed. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: Devil's Creek was cursed. And yet, outsiders kept coming. Curiosity has always been stronger than caution, and for every man who entered the caves, the smoke seemed to rise just a little thicker. By the turn of the century, Devil's Creek was no longer just a place on a map. It had become a warning stitched into the fabric of Appalachian folklore. Parents spoke the name in whispers, preachers thundered it from pulpits, and travelers marked it on their charts with crosses and skulls. It was said the land itself had turned against God, that the limestone cliffs hid a hunger older than man, and at the heart of that curse were still the McGraws. Stories shifted with each telling, but the essence remained the same. Men who had once been butchers had become something more, or something less. In one version, they were demons in human skin, walking the ridgelines only on nights when the moon was black. In another, they were bound to the caves by a pact with the devil, feeding him flesh in exchange for immortality. Some swore that if you camped near Devil's Creek, you could hear Jonah sharpening his cleaver on the rocks, the scrape carrying through the hollows like a death knell. Others spoke of Elias, pale-eyed and smiling, stepping into campsites to share a meal, only for the guests to vanish by dawn. What frightened people most was the consistency of the disappearances. Every few years, someone was taken, never in crowds, never in daylight, always alone or in pairs. A trapper, a traveler, a child fetching water. Belongings left behind, animals unharmed. The pattern was too deliberate to dismiss as wild beasts or bandits. And each time the smoke returned, hickory-scented, heavy and unmistakable. The valley began to hollow out. Families moved west, farms were abandoned, and the land grew over with brambles. By 1905, only a handful of stubborn souls remained, living like hermits, too poor or too proud to leave. These survivors spoke of voices at night, low chants echoing from the caves, woven with sobs and laughter. One woman swore she saw Levy McGraw himself, broad-shouldered and silent, hauling something heavy across the creek under a blood-red sunset. When she ran to fetch neighbors, the tracks in the mud were gone. And yet, despite the terror, curiosity endured. Writers, mystics and thrill-seekers arrived, hoping to witness the truth behind the legend. None stayed long, for the McGraws, it seemed, had become more than men. They had become the curse of the mountain itself. As the new century dawned, the industrial world pressed deeper into Appalachia. Railroads carved their way through ridges, and coal companies bought up whole valleys. Devil's Creek, once isolated and forgotten, became a curiosity for surveyors, prospectors, and scholars. But with every step forward, the legend of the McGraws only grew darker. In 1912, a team of university researchers from Lexington arrived, armed with maps, notebooks, and a determination to separate fact from folklore. They dismissed the tales of curses and cannibals as backwoods superstition, the kind of ghost stories country folk used to explain misfortune. For weeks, they camped near the cliffs, cataloging caves and collecting samples. On the fourth week, they entered the largest cavern, a jagged moor locals called the Butcher's Gate. Only 2 men returned. Both were pale, shivering, unable to speak. Their hair had turned white, though neither was older than 30. Within days, one hanged himself in camp. The other disappeared during the night, leaving only his boots by the fire. The coal companies fared no better. In 1921, engineers tried blasting through the caves to test for seams. Dynamite shook the valley, collapsing whole chambers. For a brief moment, it seemed the curse had been buried under stone. But weeks later, 3 miners vanished in the tunnels, their lamps found extinguished at the entrance to a fissure. The rest of the crew refused to continue, swearing they had heard voices singing in the dark. Not echoes, but words, in a tongue none could recognize. Reporters came next. In the 1930s, pulp magazines were filled with lurid tales of the cannibals of Kentucky, painting the McGraws as ghouls who stalked the ridges. Sensationalized or not, the articles drew curiosity seekers, Boy Scouts on a dare, drifters chasing fame, city men with cameras and whiskey. Many returned empty-handed, claiming nothing but shadows. But enough never came back to keep the legend alive, and always there was the smoke. Even in an age of coal furnaces and steel rails, locals swore that on still nights, the air near Devil's Creek carried the scent of hickory, mingled with something far more disturbing. The smell drifted through the hollows like a reminder, a warning. The McGraws, it seemed, were not a story of the past. They were patient, eternal, and still feeding. By the early 1940s, the United States was at war, and even the remote Appalachian ridges became part of the machine. The Army designated sections of southeastern Kentucky as training grounds for soldiers who would soon march into Europe. Temporary camps sprouted near Devil's Creek, their barracks echoing with drills, shouted commands, and the rattle of rifles. For a time, the valley felt alive again. Men laughing, fires burning, trucks rolling down trails that had once only known mules. But what the military brought was not order. It was bait. One platoon assigned to practice cave maneuvers was sent into the limestone tunnels above the valley. Locals begged the officers to reconsider, but warnings were met with laughter. These were trained men, armed and disciplined. What threat could shadows hold against the U.S. Army? The soldiers entered at dawn, their helmets bobbing like iron lanterns in the mist. By evening, only 5 stumbled back, their uniforms shredded, faces bloodless, eyes wide with terror. The survivors could not explain what had happened. They spoke of sounds, not gunfire, not rockfall, but voices. Low, guttural, calling names they could not have known. When pressed, one soldier muttered a single word, McGraw. He refused to say more, and within weeks, he was shipped to a military hospital, deemed unfit for combat. The official report blamed gas pockets in the caves that caused hallucinations. But the men who lived near Devil's Creek knew better. They said the McGraws were hungry again. Whispers spread quickly through the ranks, and soon the army abandoned its training exercises in that valley. The land was written off as geologically unstable, though no one could point to any collapse or hazard. By 1944, the barracks stood empty, their roofs sagging under snow, their walls haunted by silence. But soldiers carried stories wherever they went. In far-off battlefields, men spoke of a cursed family in Kentucky that no bomb could erase, no rifle could kill. Some claimed that if you listened in the trenches at night, you could hear them. The same guttural chants carried across an ocean. The McGraw name, once whispered only by mountain families, was now stitched into the minds of men fighting on foreign soil. And though the war raged in Europe and the Pacific, in one forgotten hollow of Kentucky, a much older war was still being fought. A war between memory and hunger. The war ended, and with it came a wave of prosperity that touched even the forgotten valleys of Appalachia. Highways cut through the ridges, bringing cars and diners to places that had never known more than wagon trails. Developers saw opportunity in every hollow. To them, Devil's Creek was not cursed ground. It was untapped land, a potential rest stop for travelers, maybe even a scenic overlook with a lodge and cabins. Money blinded them to the warnings whispered by those who still remembered the old stories. In 1951, surveyors arrived with bright machines and clipboards, their laughter bouncing off the cliffs as if daring the shadows to answer. They mapped the creek, staked markers, and planned where the road would run. But soon their reports grew strange. Entire sections of their notes were smeared, as though written by trembling hands. One man's journal, later found abandoned in his truck, contained only one legible line across the final page: "They're still here, watching." The first construction crews arrived in spring. Bulldozers roared across the valley, leveling trees and grinding soil that had not been disturbed in generations. Within a week, the accidents began. A worker was crushed under a machine whose brakes inexplicably failed. Another fell into a pit that no one remembered digging. A third simply vanished while clearing brush, his lunch pail found neatly placed on a stump, his hard hat resting beside it, as though he had calmly set them down before walking into the trees. Locals muttered that the McGraws were angry, that their resting place was being desecrated. The company dismissed it all as superstition, blaming faulty equipment and worker carelessness. But progress slowed to a crawl as fear seeped into the crews. Men refused to work alone, some demanded to be reassigned. Others fled in the middle of the night, abandoning paychecks and belongings just to escape the valley. By 1953, the project was quietly abandoned. The half-built road ended abruptly at the edge of the hollow, a strip of pavement that led nowhere, swallowed by weeds. Officially, the company cited unforeseen geological instability, but those who lived nearby told a different story. At night, along the unfinished road, headlights sometimes revealed figures standing in the trees, tall, gaunt, watching. The modern world had tried to pave over the curse, but the McGraws could not be buried under concrete. The 1960s swept America into upheaval. Cities burned with protests, young men vanished into jungles overseas, and across the nation, restless souls sought escape from a world they no longer trusted. Some turned to communes, others to drugs, and a few, the most reckless, to forgotten places whispered about in legends. Devil's Creek became one of those places. At first, it was drifters, hitchhikers who slipped off the highways and followed rumors of the haunted hollow. They came with guitars and sleeping bags, eager to brag they had camped where no one else dared. But locals noticed they rarely stayed long or returned at all. A backpack might wash up along the creek. A car abandoned on the gravel road, keys still in the ignition. Always silence where laughter had been. By the late 60s, the counterculture's fascination with the occult had taken hold. Groups of young men and women, clad in beads and robes, began seeking Devil's Creek deliberately. They came not to defy the legend, but to embrace it. They brought candles, chalk, and dog-eared copies of grimoires bought in dusty bookstores. To them, the McGraws were not monsters. They were guides to hidden knowledge, forgotten saints of darkness. One such group, 5 in number, arrived in 1969. They set up camp near the Butcher's Gate Cavern, scrawling symbols across the rocks. That night, neighbors reported strange lights flickering on the ridges. Not fire, not lanterns, but a greenish glow that pulsed like breath. The chanting carried for miles foreign words that twisted the night air. By dawn, the camp was silent. Their van was still there, its doors open, radio playing static. The ground around the cavern was littered with burned candles, and on the stone wall, written in what looked disturbingly like blood, was a single phrase, "We heard them answer." The disappearance sparked a brief flurry of attention. Reporters came, searching for a story of runaway kids or drug-fueled accidents. But the sheriff's men refused to search the caves, and the families of the missing soon fell silent, as though afraid to press the matter further. The papers moved on. The valley went quiet again. But not entirely. Locals began to speak of drumbeats echoing from the woods on moonless nights, of silhouettes gathering near the cliffs. The counterculture had sought communion with the curse, and instead had given it new worshippers. The McGraws were no longer just feared. They were revered. The 1970s were a decade of paranoia. The Cold War had burrowed into every corner of American life, and whispers of secret weapons and hidden threats sent government men poking into shadows that had been left undisturbed for centuries. Devil's Creek, with its history of disappearances, rumors of voices, and strange phenomena, suddenly found itself of interest to men in suits rather than sheriffs. In 1974, a small team arrived under the banner of geological surveyors. But locals noticed their equipment was far more sophisticated than soil drills. They carried radiation detectors, reel-to-reel recorders, even experimental infrared cameras. They spoke in clipped phrases, rarely smiled, and never revealed who had sent them. Some believed it was the army. Others swore it was the CIA, chasing whispers that the Soviets were experimenting with psychic warfare. For weeks, the men set up camp near the abandoned road, stringing wires into the caves, leaving microphones deep in the rock. They asked questions no geologist would ever ask. Have you seen figures at night? Do you hear voices when you're alone? Have you ever smelled smoke where no fire burned? Their tone was clinical, but their eyes betrayed something else. Curiosity mingled with dread. Then, one night in November, all activity ceased. Locals recalled hearing a low humming, like machinery buried under the earth. Dogs barked and howled. Lights flickered in nearby farmhouses. By morning, the camp was deserted. Tents stood empty, coffee still warm in a tin cup. The recording equipment was gone, though deep grooves in the mud suggested it had been dragged, not carried, toward the cavern mouth. Only a single reel was left behind, half buried. Those who listened to it later swore they heard more than static. At first, the tape was filled with echoes of dripping water, boots scraping stone. Then came whispers overlapping, inhumanly fast, yet somehow speaking names, real names. One of the surveyors cried out. There was a sudden crash, and then laughter. Not a single voice, but a chorus, layered and wet, rising until the tape cut off in a shriek of feedback. The government never acknowledged the incident. Files were sealed, names redacted. But locals say that afterward, strange black sedans occasionally appeared near Devil's Creek, engines idling for hours, watching the woods before slipping away. If the McGraws had once been a curse for mountain folk alone, the 1970s proved something far more dangerous. Even the government couldn't control them. By the 1980s, America had grown addicted to spectacle. Television thrived on shock value, tabloid magazines fed on fear, and cable networks competed to turn every dark corner of the country into late-night entertainment. To producers in New York and Los Angeles, Devil's Creek was not a place to avoid. It was untapped ratings gold. The first to arrive were the adventurers, weekend warriors with camcorders slung over their shoulders, eager to capture authentic paranormal footage. They came in jeeps, blasting rock music as they drank and laughed their way down the unfinished highway. Their tapes always began the same: cocky introductions, swaggering boasts, promises to prove the myth wrong. But the endings were another matter. Some tapes were found abandoned in the mud, the last seconds filled with frantic shouts and frantic light beams darting across stone walls. Others never surfaced at all, their owners simply vanishing into the hollow. Then came the television cruise. In 1983, a syndicated program called Mysteries of the Unknown sent a team of 5 into Devil's Creek to film a Halloween special. They promised viewers seances, ghost hunts, even live exploration of the Butcher's Gate Cavern. Only fragments of their footage aired. The broadcast showed the crew joking, setting up cameras and walking into the cave. Then the feed cut to black, replaced by a voice-over explaining that technical difficulties had ended the expedition. Behind the scenes, network staff whispered about screams caught on the final reels, and one camera left recording on its side, lens cracked, showing nothing but boots dragging across the dirt. The episode was quietly shelved, never rerun, its crew listed as missing in the field. The network moved on to tamer stories. But among horror enthusiasts, copies of the unaired footage began circulating in underground VHS markets. They claimed you could hear children's laughter echoing under the screams. Not all attention came from cameras. Entrepreneurs tried to build McGraw haunted tours in the mid-80s, bizzing thrill seekers into the hollow with promises of staged scares. The first season ended in disaster. Guests reported hearing footsteps behind them, even when staff swore no one was there. One group fled screaming after a pale figure appeared on the ridge. Too tall, too thin to be a man. The tour company folded within weeks, its owners refusing to ever speak of the venture again. The McGraws had survived farmers, soldiers, even government men. Now, they had entered the age of media, and the cameras only amplified their hunger. The 1990s arrived with a new kind of frontier, not in the woods, but in glowing screens and dial-up tones. The McGraw Curse, once carried mouth-to-mouth in whispered legend, found itself reborn in the wild, unregulated world of the early internet. It began in message boards. On paranormal forums buried between UFO sightings and Bigfoot debates, a strange thread appeared: the McGraw Hollow Files. The poster claimed to be a former government worker who had seen classified reports from the 1974 disappearance. He described caves that breathed like lungs, voices that named you before you entered. Most readers dismissed it as fiction, but some leaned closer to their monitors, chilled by the detail. Soon the thread grew, fed by anonymous accounts of travelers vanishing near Devil's Creek, by grainy scans of supposed maps marked with X, and by eerie audio files said to be lifted from confiscated reels. Then came the urban explorers. Cheap camcorders and early digital recorders gave a generation of thrill seekers the tools to chase notoriety. They entered the hollow with flashlights and bravado, eager to upload footage to fledgling video sites. Some clips showed nothing more than rusting machinery or dripping stalactites. But others revealed flickers, shapes darting across the frame, a handprint smeared on a lens long-fingered and wet. One notorious clip, uploaded in 1998, ended with the camera falling sideways, catching only a single frame of something crouched in the dark. Too pale, too sharp, bone to be human. The uploader was never heard from again. By the end of the decade, Devil's Creek had become an online legend. Forums debated whether the McGraws were feral descendants, demons, or something older than both. Conspiracy sites tied the family to government experiments, claiming the CIA had sealed off whole sections of the ridge. Others treated it like an internet challenge, daring users to spend one night in the hollow. But amid the chaos of speculation, one truth held steady every year: more names were added to the list of the missing. And the more the internet spread the story, the more people came chasing it. The McGraw Curse no longer needed whispers in the taverns of Appalachia. It had gone global, and the hunger that had once been confined to a single valley was now carried in every story, every post, every shaky video clip shared at midnight. The McGraws had followed mankind into the digital age. The new millennium brought broadband, handheld cameras, and a hunger for content that never slept. The McGraw legend, once a niche fascination on message boards, erupted into mainstream obsession. Ghost hunting shows filled cable networks, chasing every abandoned asylum and creaking farmhouse they could find. Inevitably, Devil's Creek was put on their maps. In 2004, a reality TV crew filmed an episode titled The Haunting of Devil's Creek. Their trailers promised night vision hunts, EVP recordings, and confrontations with the cursed McGraw spirits. But the broadcast was never completed. What aired was a heavily edited version, a few shaky clips of the crew laughing nervously, one segment of them entering the Butcher's Gate cavern, then an abrupt cut to credits. Rumors spread that unedited footage showed a crewman collapsing, shrieking that something was inside his head. Others whispered that the network had lost 2 cameramen entirely. When viewers called for the full episode, the producers simply pulled it from rotation and refused to speak of it again. The void was quickly filled online. Amateur ghost hunters, teenagers with borrowed camcorders, thrill seekers with cheap night vision rigs began flocking to the hollow. By then, YouTube was in its infancy, and the McGraw Curse became a challenge for clout. Videos with titles like 24 Hours in Devil's Creek and Exploring McGraw Hollow at 3 a.m. drew millions of clicks. Most ended predictably, frightened kids running from shadows, screaming at raccoons, or daring each other to enter the caves. But a handful chilled viewers to the bone. One viral clip from 2007 showed 3 explorers walking into a cavern, laughing as their flashlights scanned the stone. Minutes later, their voices faltered. The beam caught something crouched against the wall, thin, angular, staring directly at the lens. The camera jerked, fell, and rolled, catching only the explorers' screams fading into the dark. The video ended with silence, the light flickering out. No follow-up was ever posted. By 2009, live streaming had arrived. That year, a pair of ghost hunters broadcasted their exploration live to thousands of viewers. For 2 hours, the feed showed nothing unusual. Then, without warning, the camera tilted, capturing the ceiling of the cave. A voice, not theirs, whispered a name. The stream froze. Viewers flooded the chat with panic. The feed never resumed. Neither hunter was seen again. The internet had given the McGraws an audience, and the audience only fed them. By the 2010s, the McGraw name was no longer just a shadow whispered on backroads. It had become a viral obsession, the kind of story shared in Reddit threads, dissected in podcasts, and exploited by streaming platforms hungry for true crime meets paranormal content. Devil's Creek was mapped on Google Earth, tagged in travel blogs, and stalked by drones that hummed above the trees. But with visibility came something darker, consequences too large to ignore. The first headline hit in 2013. A group of 5 college students from Ohio vanished while filming a documentary about Appalachia's lost families. Their abandoned car was found on the gravel shoulder near the unfinished road, cameras and laptops still inside. The final footage on one device showed them entering the cavern, joking nervously. Then a frame of sudden static. And in that static, if you slowed it enough, the shape of something tall, stretched, smiling too wide. The footage was leaked online before police could suppress it, sparking weeks of viral frenzy. Conspiracy theorists argued over every pixel while grieving families begged for the video to be taken down. It never was. Police and state officials launched formal investigations, but the search yielded nothing. No bodies, no evidence, just abandoned campsites, strange symbols carved into trees, and the smell of smoke in places where no fire had burned. One sheriff publicly declared the area a danger to public safety and ordered it sealed off. Within weeks, he was found dead in his patrol car, the engine still running, his face pale, eyes wide as though frozen in terror. By 2017, streaming giants released glossy, true crime documentaries about the curse, but viewers reported something unsettling. Midway through certain episodes, whispers bled into the audio track, not part of production, not listed in subtitles, but they're all the same, names. Sometimes the names of viewers themselves, spoken in a wet rasp. Forums filled with posts from people who claimed the McGraws had followed them home after watching. Doors opening at night, windows rattling, children speaking in voices that were not their own. The legend had broken free of the hollow. No longer confined to caves or ridges, the curse had gone global, carried on screens into living rooms and bedrooms across the world. The McGraws were no longer waiting in the dark. The dark was coming to you. And once it speaks your name, escape is no longer possible.